You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
A couple weeks before Thanksgiving in 2015, a woman named Cicely Odom Rose made her way along the buffet line of a holiday potluck party, loading up her plate with a little bit of everything. Once it was full, she carried it across the room to her 15-year-old daughter, Kennedy. Cicely and her daughter were best friends, and they bonded over their shared loves, like parties, their tight-knit family in Memphis, and of course, great home-cooked food. But when Cicely handed the plate of food to her daughter, Kennedy sort of waved the plate away, pointing at her jaw. Kennedy had just gotten her braces tightened the day before, and apparently they still hurt too much for her to chew. It would turn out both Kennedy and her mother, Cicely, had both gotten braces on their teeth at the same time back in February. But their dental journeys since then had been very different. Cicely didn't really mind or even notice the braces very much, but Kennedy found hers totally aggravating, and every time hers were tightened, she'd be in pain for days. Cicely handed Kennedy's plate of food to a family friend and then took a seat next to her daughter. Cicely could see on Kennedy's face how disappointed she was. This annual family party was something she looked forward to every year. And so Cicely gave Kennedy a big hug and promised her she would feel better soon. Early the next morning, Cicely awoke to Kennedy knocking on her bedroom door. And when her daughter opened the door, she looked exhausted, and she told Cicely that she actually had barely slept all night because her head was throbbing so badly. Cicely grabbed a bottle of aspirin from her bedside table, shook a few pills into her hand, and gave them to Kennedy. Cicely told her daughter to take the pills and go back to bed. A little pain relief and rest could cure anything. But a couple of hours later, when Cicely poked her head into her daughter's room, she found Kennedy curled on her side with a pillow over her head, and she would tell her mother that the pills hadn't helped and her headache was still pounding. Cicely walked over to her daughter and placed the back of her hand against Kennedy's forehead to see if she was burning up. And she did feel slightly warm, but Cicely was now suddenly more worried about Kennedy's lips. They looked swollen and inflamed. She wondered if Kennedy might have caught some sort of bug or rash at the party. Cicely got an ice pack from the freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and had Kennedy hold it to her lips to try to reduce the swelling. Then she brought Kennedy some more aspirin and also fluffed up her pillows. But as she stood to leave, Cicely's heart broke to see her daughter in so much obvious discomfort. And so she made a mental note to plan something fun for Kennedy as soon as she was better. But the next morning, Kennedy had not improved at all. Cicely found her curled up in a fetal position under the covers, looking even weaker and more haggard after another bad night's sleep. Kennedy told her mother that in addition to all these symptoms she was feeling, that at some point in the previous night, her throat had also started to hurt, and now there was a stabbing pain every time she swallowed. And so at this point, Cicely decided enough was enough. She helped Kennedy get dressed and then guided her out to the car and drove her to the nearest clinic. After being shown to an exam room, a nurse gave Kennedy a checkup and swabbed her throat to run some tests. And while they waited, Cicely held her daughter close to her chest and rocked her back and forth, just like she had when she was a little girl. Cicely couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter this sick. I mean, her daughter looked hollowed out and wrecked. Cicely could tell that, whatever this was, it couldn't be normal. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Kennedy's doctor came inside, and he told them he had good and bad news. The bad news was that Kennedy had caught a bacterial infection called strep throat, which is very painful. It's like the worst sore throat you can get. But the good news was that if Kennedy took a few days of antibiotics, she would bounce right back. And so the doctor scribbled out a prescription, handed it to Cicely, and then told Kennedy she would feel better soon. But just a few days later, Cicely's car came to a stop in front of a hospital, and then she and her daughter went inside of the ER. Cicely told the doctor on duty about Kennedy's strep throat diagnosis and how she had been taking antibiotics for a few days without any signs of improvement. Then suddenly this morning, things went south. Kennedy woke up vomiting from pain, and sores had broken out all over the inside of her mouth. The doctor nodded and asked Kennedy to open up her mouth. And after she had, the doctor used a tongue depressor and flashlight and began examining the walls of her mouth and all around her tongue. Kennedy whimpered at the touch, and then eventually, at the end of the examination, the doctor swabbed one of Kennedy's sores and handed the sample to a nurse who took it to the lab. And then the doctor walked out of the exam room, leaving the mother and daughter alone. As Cicely stood behind Kennedy, stroking her hair, she wondered if the sores in her daughter's mouth might be some sort of complication from the antibiotics. Kennedy had never been allergic to medication as a child, but she knew that sometimes allergies don't develop until later in life. Either way, Cicely felt confident that the hospital would figure out what was going on with her daughter, and they would get her started on the right treatment. Eventually, the doctor returned, and he told Cicely that Kennedy was still testing positive for strep throat. However, her strep infection had nothing to do with the sores. He said that, most likely the sores were being caused by some sort of virus, but he wouldn't know for sure until they ran more tests. In the meantime, the doctor told Cicely that he wanted to rule out more serious possibilities, namely Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a rare but sometimes deadly skin disease. At hearing this, Cicely felt blindsided. She didn't understand how an ordinary case of strep throat could have anything to do with this potentially fatal condition the doctor was talking about. Cicely tried to keep her composure for her daughter's sake, but it was hard to act calm with news like this. Once the doctor left the room again, Cicely whipped out her phone and called Kennedy's godmother, Tamara. Tamara had always been a rock for Cicely's family. She was one of those people who just always seemed to know what to do in stressful situations. And so Cicely gripped her daughter's hand tightly as she explained to Tamara everything that had happened over the past few days. She told Tamara that she and Kennedy really needed her help because Kennedy's journey to recovery was starting to look like a rocky road. 3 months later, Cicely sat in another hospital room watching a doctor examine Kennedy's abdomen. She barely recognized her daughter's body anymore. Kennedy looked skeletal and frail, having lost more than 30 pounds in the past few months, and none of the doctors they had visited so far could figure out why. Now, Kennedy had stopped testing positive for the strep bacteria, but her other symptoms, like sore throat, swollen lips, fevers, and various mysterious aches, those hadn't gone away. But worst of all the symptoms were the sores in Kennedy's mouth. They had only grown more painful and more sensitive until Kennedy finally just stopped being able to eat. Cicely had even asked Tamara to make her famous homemade chicken soup, which had always been Kennedy's favorite food, but the sores still hurt too much for her to even finish a small cup of it. And so day after day, Cicely watched her daughter get thinner and weaker until finally it got so bad that Kennedy had to stop going to school. She just didn't have the strength to make it through the day without going to bed. But not seeing her friends really only deepened Kennedy's depression. Cicely took Kennedy to every doctor and every specialist around Memphis, but they were all mystified by what could be causing her symptoms. And so today's appointment was for an ultrasound to try to get a clearer picture of Kennedy's organs. As the doctor moved the ultrasound wand along Kennedy's body, searching for anything unusual, Kennedy suddenly cried out in pain. She told the doctor that the area he had just touched felt like a knife was going into her side. The doctor quickly wheeled the ultrasound machine closer to Kennedy's bedside and then turned the screen so Cicely could see what he was seeing. Cicely couldn't quite tell what she was looking at on the screen since the image was grainy and pixelated, but the doctor kept his eyes glued to one spot as he carefully moved the wand up and down on Kennedy's body. Eventually, the doctor set the wand down, wiped the gel off of Kennedy's belly from the ultrasound machine, and pulled off his gloves. He told Cicely that what he'd just seen on the ultrasound was very worrisome. Kennedy's spleen looked very enlarged. Since the spleen is what filters blood and fights off infections, when it's not functioning properly, then the whole body is extremely vulnerable. Not only that, but most causes of an enlarged spleen are serious, from infections to anemia, and even to certain cancers like leukemia, which affects the blood and bones. The doctor apologized for not having better news, but it looked likely that Kennedy was up against something pretty severe. Cicely didn't even know how to react. She looked over at her poor daughter, who looked so small and defenseless lying on the bed, and she just couldn't understand why all these horrible things were happening to such a sweet and innocent girl. And so once the doctor left, Cicely pulled out her phone and hatched a new plan. It was time to stop waiting for a miracle. Days later, Kennedy's godmother, Tamara, knocked on the door of the Odom family home. Tamara took her role as godmother very seriously, and she, like Cicely, had been worried sick throughout Kennedy's ordeal. Tonight, Cicely had invited her over to discuss the whole situation and try to do some research. When Cicely opened the door, Tamara pulled her in for a big hug. She could see the stress all over Cicely's face. Tamara couldn't even imagine what it would be like to have one of her own children go through something this harrowing and sort of being helpless to stop it. Once inside the house, Tamara went ahead and poured 2 big glasses of wine and then followed Cicely to her computer. The women took turns searching medical forums for descriptions of cases that were similar to Kennedy's, but they didn't find anything that matched. And so eventually, Tamara asked Cicely to walk her through every detail of Kennedy's recent doctor's appointments while she made notes of everything. Tamara had a feeling that there had to be some clue staring them right in the face about what was going on with Kennedy. She just didn't know what it was yet. And so, before leaving, Tamara just told Cicely that she wanted to go wish Kennedy goodnight. And so she walked down the hall, knocked softly on Kennedy's door, and then went in and took a seat on the edge of her goddaughter's bed. And when she looked down at Kennedy, she was disturbed at how thin she looked. The girl used to be such a vibrant teenager, but now she was like a shell of herself. And then Tamara told Kennedy that as soon as her appetite came back, she would cook her a whole buffet of her favorite foods to try to put some meat back on her bones. Now, Tamara didn't say that to be a joke, but Kennedy sort of laughed and cracked a smile when she said it. But as Kennedy did, with her mouth wide open in full view of Tamara, suddenly a light bulb went off in Tamara's head. She didn't know how she would prove this, but she thought if she was right about her theory about Kennedy, it would explain everything. Tamara kissed Kennedy on the forehead and tucked her back in, and then slipped out the door to go share her new theory with Cicely. Now, Cicely was skeptical. To her, the idea was too obvious to be true. She found it impossible to believe that all of Kennedy's doctors would have overlooked something so simple. Tamara agreed with Cicely that it could be a long shot, but given all that Kennedy had gone through already, they owed it to her to follow every lead. And so Cicely nodded, thanked her friend, and told Tamara she'd do some more research. Weeks later, Cicely got a call from the hospital. They told her that a specialist had been assigned to Kennedy's case, a Dr. Mitchell Godat. When Dr. Godat had heard about Tamara's new theory that she had learned after looking at her goddaughter's mouth, it gave him an idea. He thought Kennedy's enlarged spleen indicated an allergic reaction, so he asked Cicely to bring Kennedy back to the hospital so they could test different allergens on her skin. And that hospital visit would accomplish what none of the others had been able to do: isolating the cause of Kennedy's symptoms. And the cause had been staring them all in the face since day one. When the doctors told Cicely, she was speechless. Once again, Tamara had been right. That night in Kennedy's bedroom, when Kennedy had sort of laughed at Tamara talking about putting meat in her bones, well, Tamara had looked down and noticed the girl's braces were reflecting in the light of the bedside lamp, which made her wonder, what if Kennedy's braces were the issue? And so Tamara had suggested this to Cicely, and then after Tamara went home that night, Cicely thought back and realized that all of Kennedy's health problems began after her daughter's braces were put in. And she also remembered that every time Kennedy had her braces tightened, she would complain of intense pain in her mouth, and the pain seemed to only get worse as time went on. Cicely had mentioned this to Kennedy's orthodontist the first time it happened, but he told her that for some kids, braces are far more uncomfortable than for others, and it really was nothing to worry about. But in fact, it was something to worry about. It turned out Kennedy was allergic to nickel, which is what her braces were made of. It was the strep infection that finally pushed things over the edge. The allergy didn't give her strep throat, but the two problems combined caused Kennedy's immune system to begin attacking her body and making her much, much sicker. That's when she started getting the headaches, the sores, and everything else. Dr. Godat told Cicely that her daughter's symptoms would have only worsened and intensified if they had not identified her nickel allergy. Left untreated, her condition could have even turned fatal. Cicely was overcome with relief. Right away, she took Kennedy to the orthodontist and got her braces removed, and within hours, Kennedy began feeling better. And soon, she would make a full recovery. One dusty summer afternoon in 2013, a man named John Lee sighed with relief as he pulled his Jeep into the driveway of his family's home in Australia. John and his family had been on a very nice weekend getaway into the outback to camp and hunt, but the whole drive back home had been an absolute horror show. His 8-year-old son Mason would not stop fidgeting and talking and fighting with his siblings, and so it made the already very long drive back home feel twice as long. The second John turned off the car, Mason flung the door open and sprinted off. John looked over at his wife, Patty, and they shared a look of absolute exhaustion. Mason had always been hyperactive, but lately his crazy energy had really ramped up. His siblings basically tolerated it, but sometimes even they seemed overwhelmed by Mason's frantic dash from one thing to the next. John got out and opened up the trunk and began unloading the car, while Patty took the kids inside. Inside the garage, John stacked the family's tents and sleeping bags in big storage tubs, and then placed his shotgun and ammunition in a standing gun rack. Finally, he carefully packed the wild geese that he'd killed into an industrial-sized freezer. He would pluck and prepare them later for future family dinners. Once everything was packed away, John went inside the house, where his wife was in the kitchen putting away food. Patty asked him if Mason was with him, but John told her that he had assumed the boy was inside with her. Patty stopped unpacking and shot John a worried look. It was never a good sign when neither of them knew what Mason was up to. John left the kitchen to go find out what sort of hyperactive mischief his son had gotten into this time. And he could hear the destruction even before he saw it. He found Mason holding a hammer, completely destroying his playhouse. And so as John stood there, shocked, surveying the wreckage, he realized this couldn't wait any longer. Mason needed professional help. Later that week, John sat next to his son in the lobby of a pediatrician's office, waiting for Mason's appointment. And as they waited, Mason wouldn't stop ripping the leaves off of potted plants, and so John just handed him a magazine to tear apart instead. When the receptionist finally called for them, John and Mason followed a nurse down a hall and into an examination room. Once Mason's pediatrician, who was named Dr. Stephen Thomas, walked into the room, John explained that Mason had been acting strangely lately. The way he played had turned aggressive. He was now breaking his siblings' toys and riding his bike right through the neighbors' gardens. And so now John said, he and his wife were overwhelmed and they were worried that there might be something medically wrong with Mason. Dr. Thomas nodded and said he would order some blood tests. Then he asked Mason to sit on the examination table while a nurse came in and drew a few vials of his blood. And so while that was happening, the doctor asked John what Mason's daily life was like. What did he eat? What did he like to do? John told him the family ate a very balanced diet, including some wild game, and Mason lived a very active outdoor life, exploring the neighborhood, swimming, and playing with friends. And until recently, John said, his son had been a very normal boy. The doctor jotted down some notes and then told them to go get some lunch and come back in the afternoon when Mason's blood work would be ready. A couple hours later, John and Mason came back to the same examination room, and not long after, Dr. Thomas entered carrying printouts of Mason's results, and he told John he had some worrying news. He said Mason's blood contained dangerously elevated levels of lead. The doctor explained that lead poisoning can have very serious consequences, especially in children. High levels of lead in the blood can cause permanent mental disabilities. It can also lead to hyperactive behavior and the very kind of violent outbursts that Mason had been having. John was speechless. He couldn't imagine where or how Mason could be coming into that much contact with a toxic heavy metal. John immediately wondered if this meant his other children were also lead poisoned. Dr. Thomas asked John if their house was older, because if it was possible there was lead in the house paint. He also asked John if they maybe had some old toys or old heirlooms in the house, because those too could have lead in them. John racked his brain picturing his son's room, but all of his son's toys and furniture were all fairly new. And then also, John knew that paint used to contain high levels of lead, but their home had been built after the Australian government had cracked down on lead paint in the 1970s, and so John knew his house was safe. And so after telling the doctor this, the doctor just told John that it was extremely important that he find out where the lead was coming from and to take action to stop the exposure. And so John said he would talk it over with his wife and see what they could figure out. Early the next week, John returned home from running errands to find Patty inside of Mason's bedroom. And Mason was curled up in a ball in his bed, saying that there was a stabbing pain in his gut that wouldn't stop. Patty told John that she had given Mason tea and some fizzy water, thinking it might help settle his stomach, but neither had helped. John couldn't bear to hear his son whimper and moan like this. The boy seemed to be in far more pain than just a normal stomachache. So John just told Patty he was going to take Mason back to the doctor. Then he scooped Mason up in his arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him out to the car. At the clinic, the receptionist waved John and Mason through to see Dr. Thomas immediately. John explained that his son had suddenly developed severe stomach pains, and so the doctor immediately sent Mason to get his stomach x-rayed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Thomas pulled up the x-rays on the computer inside of Mason's exam room. John stared at the black and white picture of his son's ribcage and his spine, and towards the bottom of the x-ray, in the middle of Mason's gut, was a scattering of small white circles. But John had no idea what they were. The doctor lowered his voice and told John he couldn't identify the quarter-inch wide objects in the x-ray either, but there were a lot of them. They were definitely metallic, and they were lodged in the lower right side of Mason's abdomen. He told John that at some point Mason must have swallowed these things, and then somehow they had gotten stuck in his intestines rather than just passing through. The doctor suspected that these objects were the things causing Mason's abdominal distress. Dr. Thomas walked over to Mason's bed and pulled up a stool and sat down, and then he asked Mason if he'd eaten anything strange recently, maybe on a dare from friends. John watched as his son opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then Mason stopped. And then Mason just shook his head and told the doctor that nope, he couldn't think of anything like that. Dr. Thomas shrugged and gave Mason a gentle pat on the leg, and then he stood up and pulled John to the side of the room. He told John that the most important thing here was for these objects to be removed immediately. They could be responsible for the lead in his system, and the longer they stayed in Mason's body, the higher the risk that they would begin to poison Mason or cause a bowel obstruction. John was feeling totally overwhelmed, but he just asked the doctor, what are the next steps then? Dr. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said Mason would need a medical-grade enema to clean his digestive tract. This was guaranteed to flush out any foreign objects. Dr. Thomas had actually already referred Mason's case to another doctor, Dr. Joseph Malouf, who would supervise the procedure. Dr. Thomas promised John that it would be quick and not at all painful for Mason. He would just feel very full. John and Patty could even be there to hold their son's hand throughout the whole thing. A couple hours later, Dr. Malouf went to his computer and opened an X-ray image of Mason's body that was taken after the intestinal flush. And the second he saw it, his jaw dropped. None of those metallic objects had even moved. They were all still right there in Mason's gut, the same as before. Dr. Malouf zoomed into the image and studied the cluster of round objects. The fact that the flush hadn't worked actually got him thinking. All Mason's doctors had presumed that Mason had swallowed these little balls, and therefore they must be lodged in his digestive tract. But the boy's digestive tract was now entirely empty, so these things couldn't be in his intestines. So where were they? An idea slowly began to take shape inside of Dr. Malouf's mind. It didn't really make sense, but it was possible, and if his hunch was right, it would explain everything. However, Dr. Malouf realized that his idea was pretty risky. To find out if his idea was right, Mason would have to undergo abdominal surgery. But if they did nothing, then these metal objects could wreak havoc in Mason's body. And so Dr. Malouf weighed the risks and decided there really wasn't any more time to waste. They would go forward with the surgery. It was the best and frankly only thing they could do. Days later, a surgeon carefully made an incision into Mason's abdomen. He was glad to see that the boy's organs looked normal, with no inflammation or visible infections. Using the X-ray images as his guide, the surgeon delicately isolated a small organ from the right side of Mason's gut, Mason's appendix. And as soon as he cut the organ free and he lifted it up with his forceps, he knew this was it. The appendix was much heavier than it should have been. Setting the organ down on a tray, the surgeon slowly sliced into the tissue and struck metal. Then it happened again and again. He realized that Dr. Malouf's hunch was right. By the time the surgeon was done dissecting Mason's appendix, he had discovered 57 lead pellets. While the surgeon stitched Mason back up, Dr. Maloof took one of the pellets into the waiting room and showed it to John and Patty. John instantly recognized it. He used those small lead pellets in his shotgun to hunt wild geese, which he would then cook and feed to his family. Once Mason recovered from his surgery, Dr. Maloof asked him, why didn't you tell anyone that you were eating your father's ammunition? Mason was embarrassed, but he explained that he and his siblings played a game where they would race to see who could make the most pellets disappear the fastest. And he did it by eating handfuls of these lead pellets. And the reason Mason hadn't said anything was he was worried his father would get mad at him if he found out, so he kept it a secret. Tests revealed that Mason's siblings had also been eating shotgun pellets, and so they too had elevated levels of lead in their body. And so, just like Mason, they all also underwent a bowel flushing procedure. Yet only Mason's pellets had gotten stuck in his appendix. The other children had simply passed the shotgun pellets in their bowel movements. Dr. Maloof was mystified by how the pellets got stuck inside of Mason. Occasionally, certain foods, like the seeds of small fruit, will bypass the intestines and get lodged in the appendix, but it's highly uncommon. For something the size of a lead pellet to end up there made no sense, and for it to happen 57 times really defied all logic. Dr. Maloof never did figure it out, but fortunately, Mason still made a full recovery, and gradually his lead levels decreased back to normal. But Dr. Maloof urged John to keep a closer eye on his ammunition, and to switch to pellets not made with the poisonous metal.
The crime that would eventually put Timothy Evans on death row was horrific. But when you take a look at Timothy Evans's past, it's not really a shocker that his life played out the way that it did. Before Timothy was even born in 1924 in the southern end of Wales, his father had abandoned him and his siblings and his mother. And because Timothy's mother made almost no money, when Timothy was born, he was effectively born into poverty. As a young child, Timothy really struggled to learn how to speak properly, and then in school, he just really struggled to keep up with his peers. To make matters worse, when Timothy was 8 years old, he contracted tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition is not necessarily fatal, but it causes these large, painful blisters that take a really long time to go away, even with treatment. And because Timothy's outbreak was on the underside of his foot, it made walking nearly impossible. And so for a few years, starting when he was 8 years old and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the skin, Timothy had to miss huge chunks of his schooling to get medical treatment. And then other times he was missing school simply because he couldn't walk. And considering how poorly Timothy was already doing in school, these huge extended absences were totally catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in life, it would be determined that Timothy's IQ, which is a way to measure people's intelligence, was somewhere between 60 and 70, which is very low and put him in the range of having an intellectual disability. Not long after his tuberculosis of the skin diagnosis, Timothy would remain in school despite all of these absences and despite how difficult it was for him, but his real focus would shift from getting an education to trying to find work in order to help provide for his family, who were very poor. And Timothy was willing to do just about anything for money. For example, when he was only 13 years old, he became a coal miner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet at the time and still today. But despite Timothy's willingness to do these really challenging jobs that often paid very little, he would always eventually get fired, or he just would not get the job in the first place. He would be rejected. And always it was because either one, he had a flare-up of his tuberculosis on his foot, which made it impossible to walk, and so he couldn't go to and from his job, and so he'd be let go, or it would be because of his illiteracy, and the job just could not take someone in that could not read, write, or really even speak very well. Or in some cases, like when Timothy tried to join the military when he was 18 years old, and World War II was raging and all of his peers are going off to fight the war, well, when he tried to enlist, the military said, we can't take you because you are illiterate and because of your foot. This constant cycle of rejection and embarrassment really made Timothy quite cynical. He felt like he just didn't belong anywhere. And so at some point, perhaps as a coping mechanism, Timothy began to lie. He'd make up tall tales about the adventures he'd been on and all the influential people he knew and the superhuman skills he possessed. Now, most people who knew Timothy didn't believe any of the stories he told, but every now and again, some people actually did. And for Timothy, that little sliver of respect he would get in that moment, even though it was built on a lie, on an illusion, it was incredible for him. He didn't get that anywhere else in his life, and so he kind of became addicted to telling these lies. Fast forward to 1947, Timothy was 23 years old, and he was still living with his family, who had left Wales and had moved to London, and they were living in a very, very poor and dangerous neighborhood. At the time, Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery driver and had yet to be fired from it, and on one of his daily routes around the city, he wound up meeting an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley, who he really took a liking to. Now, according to people who knew Beryl, she apparently, like Timothy, had a very low IQ. And so Beryl and Timothy, they meet on one of Timothy's routes, and they immediately hit it off and they start dating. And by the end of that year, they were married. They initially lived inside of Timothy's family's apartment, but when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, she and Timothy pooled what little money they had, and they got an apartment of their own. Their new apartment was terrible. It was tiny, it was dirty, it was located in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived, but it was good enough for them, at least at first. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, suddenly their cramped living quarters seemed impossibly small for a family of 3. And they were already extremely tight on money, and now adding a baby to the mix, they really just did not have enough money to survive. Timothy immediately tried picking up extra work wherever he could, but once again, his illiteracy and his foot, or a combination of the two, held him back. And so it wasn't long before the couple was forced to start taking out these awful high-interest loans that they knew they would never be able to pay back. So they are permanently saddled with debt. They know it. And these loans are only enough to barely get by. This is not enough to move out. This is only enough to stay in their squalid and awful conditions. And so as their debt piled up, in conjunction with all the stresses of being new parents and living in this really cramped space, it wasn't long before Beryl and Timothy's marriage just totally started to erode. It started with daily arguing over one of their many hardships, but it quickly escalated to full-blown physical confrontation that often was so loud that passerby outside in the very busy street would hear, coming from the 3rd floor, Timothy and Beryl screaming and yelling and punching each other, to the point where people outside literally stopped and just looked up, wondering what was going on up there. As Timothy's world seemed to just kind of crumble all around him, he at first turned to a coping mechanism he had used for most of his life, and that was just to lie about his current situation. He would tell people who would listen that he and his wife and his kid were doing great and everything was fine. But, behind closed doors, that wasn't true at all, and so that coping mechanism really didn't do a lot for him. And so Timothy eventually turned to alcohol to cope with his misery. But the alcohol would only make the situation worse because it was yet another thing for his wife to be mad at him about, and he was depressed all the time, and it was eating away at their non-existent budget to pay for all this alcohol. And so Timothy would turn to yet another source for comfort, but it would be a very unlikely source of comfort. It would be his downstairs neighbor, John Christie. And the reason his downstairs neighbor was so unlikely was because John could not have been more different from Timothy. John was nearly double Timothy's age. He was incredibly smart, and he was respected not only by his peers, but really by the community. And that respect came from the fact that John had served during World War I and been right on the front lines, and had nearly been killed during a mustard gas attack when he was fighting in the trenches. And then after the war was over, John would come back to London, and he would become a police constable for quite a while, and then after retiring from the force, he became a post office clerk. But despite John and Timothy's vast differences, there was one thing they had in common. Marital problems. John and his wife Ethel had gotten married back in 1920, so 4 years before Timothy had even been born. But at some point early on in their marriage, the couple had split up. They didn't get divorced, but they separated and they lived totally apart for a while. But in 1934, the couple would finally reconcile, and that's when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the apartment building that Timothy and Beryl would move into years later. So, years later, when John is sitting in his apartment and he can hear coming from the third floor, like everybody else in the general vicinity, the sound of Timothy and Beryl fighting like crazy up in their apartment, John decided, with his experience with reconciling with his wife, that he ought to reach out to that young man, Timothy, and offer him some advice, or at the very least, be a friendly sounding board. And so John would eventually strike up a conversation with Timothy one day when they were passing each other, and Timothy was at a place in his life where he was looking for friends. He didn't have any friends. And so John, to come into his life at this point, was really good for Timothy, and so very quickly those two struck up a friendship. But this friendship was not really peer-to-peer. It was more like father to son or mentor to mentee, where Timothy really looked up to John. I mean, Timothy had never had a father in his life, and so John kind of became that. And John looked at Timothy with a lot of empathy. He could tell this was a man who was, not very bright, and he was in way over his head with debt, with this marriage, with parenthood, everything. And so John tried hard to kind of coach and guide Timothy as he navigated this very rough time in his life. And their relationship likely could have had a really positive effect, not only on just Timothy's mental health, but also perhaps on the state of Timothy and Beryl's marriage. But it was not long after John met Timothy that Timothy found out Beryl was pregnant with a second child. This was terrible news for Timothy. He knew they absolutely could not afford another child. As it was, they couldn't afford the current child they had. They couldn't afford anything. And in the United Kingdom, abortions were illegal, so there was no way to terminate this pregnancy. And so, totally desperate and terrified, Timothy turned to John for guidance. And John would later recall on the witness stand during Timothy's trial that, John did his best to try to console and comfort and tell Timothy that everything was going to be okay. You'll get another job. You'll take out another loan. It'll all work out. But, as John would say on the witness stand, his words didn't have any effect on Timothy. Timothy, by the time he came to John, was totally inconsolable, he was desperate, and he was unhinged. And so John started to suspect that Timothy might do something really drastic to make his troubles go away. And John would be correct. While you lay in bed at night and you're looking up at your plastic glow-in-the-dark stars that line your ceiling, do you ever pull the blankets up to your chin and snuggle down and secretly wish to yourself, man, if I could just one time see the world-famous traditional Chinese chime bell player Post Malone clack his bells live in concert just once, my life would be made. Or, if that's not you, maybe you're the type that walks around all day imagining what it would be like to up close and personal hear with your own ears the sweet melodies from world-renowned bassoonist Dave Matthews. Well, today, fantasy becomes reality with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is a ticketing app that makes buying tickets to these incredible exclusive events super easy. Just last week, using their sweet app, I snagged front row tickets to Celine Dion's special tuba and snare drum performance. But whatever you're into, whether it's music, sports, comedy, festivals, SeatGeek has the tickets. Also, SeatGeek wants you to get an excellent deal. So when you're on their app, if you see green dots, that means good deal. You see red dots, that means bad deal. And today, SeatGeek is offering a great deal to all of you. Use code MrBallen for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. That's $20 off your first purchase with promo code MrBallen. Make sure you click the link in the description to download the app. A few weeks later, on November 30th, 1949, a very disheveled-looking Timothy wandered into a local police station in Wales, not far from where he had grown up, and he would confess to the police that he had killed his wife. He would tell the police that he had given Beryl a poison that was apparently designed to abort her fetus, but this poison was too strong and it had killed Beryl. And then after she was dead, Timothy said he panicked, and so he took her body and he dumped her down the sewer that was outside of their apartment building. And then he arranged for his daughter, Geraldine, to go stay with some people in London while Timothy fled to Wales. But after getting to Wales, Timothy said his guilty conscience was just too much, and so he turned himself in. The police immediately arrested Timothy, and they brought him back to London. And then once he was in a cell in London, London detectives went out to Timothy's apartment building, and they went to the manhole cover that led down into the sewer that was right outside of the apartment building, and right away they noticed something odd. They were not able to get the lid off of the sewer. It was just too heavy. It would move, but one man couldn't do it. And so after 3 police officers, they all got down, they were barely able to get this lid up and off of the top of the sewer. And then when they went down into the sewer, there was no body. There was nothing down there. And so when detectives went back to Timothy in the London jail cell and they confronted him with this revelation that, no, she's not in there, Timothy would kind of squirm a little bit, and then he would totally change his story. He would tell police that it was not he who gave Beryl this poison that ended up killing her. It was his friend and mentor and father-like figure in his life, John Christie. Timothy also told police that he left his daughter, Geraldine, in the care of John. Police are skeptical of Timothy, but because there's a child involved, they just immediately take his story at face value and they rush back to the apartment building and they knock on John's door, and John opens the door and he's standing there with his wife Ethel, and he's totally shocked at these accusations that have been lodged against him by who he thought was a very close friend of his. And John and Ethel would tell police that not only did they have no clue what happened to Beryl, but Geraldine had never been in their care. And so the police are immediately very concerned for Geraldine's well-being. You know, who has Geraldine? Where is she? But while they were there, they just did a thorough search of John and Ethel's property to make sure they weren't lying. And then after searching their property, there was nothing inside. But when police left John and Ethel's apartment and began searching the outside of the property, an area that they had briefly searched when they were there earlier looking in the sewer, but now they're doing a much more thorough search. And during this thorough search, they find this shed that was located in the backyard of this big apartment building. And inside of this shed, wrapped in blankets, are the bodies of Beryl and her 13-month-old daughter, Geraldine. They had both been strangled to death. After processing the crime scene, the police went back to the jail where Timothy was being held, and they would tell him what they discovered at the property, and Timothy had a very muted response to it. And then when one of the detectives asked Timothy point blank, "Are you responsible for both your wife and your daughter's deaths?" Timothy would say yes. And then during a follow-on interrogation, Timothy would confess that he had been in a heated argument with his wife over money, and at some point during this fight, which got very physical, he strangled Beryl to death. And then 2 days later, he strangled his daughter to death. And then after dumping their bodies in that shed outside, he fled to Wales. Timothy would actually recant that final confession, but it really didn't matter because when he went to trial a little over a month later, the jury just did not believe that Timothy did not do it. And so very quickly, they convicted him of murder and they sentenced him to death. Just 3 months after his conviction, so on March 9th, 1950, Timothy would find himself sitting inside of the so-called condemned suite at Pentonville Prison in London. He was shackled to this table with guards sitting on either side of him in this very small cell. And then right next to him was this wall that kind of ran down the side of the cell. And on the other side of that wall was the execution chamber. And so as Timothy would have been sitting at this table, suddenly the cell door that led into the holding area would have flung open. The execution team would have rushed in and grabbed Timothy and stood him up before he could run or fight back. And then before he knew it, he'd be pushed over to the door that went through that wall into the execution chamber. Once that door was open, Timothy only would have had maybe a couple of seconds to take in what he saw. And it would have been this pale green square room with a noose dangling down from the ceiling. And right below it was an obvious mechanical trap door. And off to the side of the room was a lever that the executioner would actually pull to open up that floor and send the prisoner falling down into the pit below. And so Timothy, he would have taken this in just for a second. His heart would have been racing, and before long, he would have been standing on this trapdoor. The noose would have come down. They would have tightened it to his neck. A bag would have been placed over his head. All the guards would have pushed to the walls, and then before Timothy could even say or do anything, the lever was pulled, and he dropped down into a 12-foot deep brick-lined pit where he would dangle by his neck until he died. This gruesome ending should have been the end of an already very gruesome story, but it wasn't. Not even close. 3 years after Timothy's execution, a man named Beresford Brown moved into the same ground floor apartment that John Christie and Ethel had shared. John had moved out just a couple of days earlier. And so Beresford, he moves into this apartment. It's totally dirty. It's not well kept. And so Beresford decides that he's going to fix the place up. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to tear down all of the old wallpaper in the kitchen and replace it. And so he goes into the kitchen, he starts tearing down the wallpaper, he makes his way into the kitchen pantry, he starts pulling the wallpaper down in there, and at some point when he pulls one strip of paper all the way to the ground, he sees towards the bottom of this wall inside of his pantry where there are no shelves over it, behind the wallpaper, there is obviously a door, just a small door. It almost looks like the entrance to a crawl space. And so Beresford is totally intrigued, why would there be this door behind the wallpaper in the pantry? And so he rips off the remaining wallpaper over this little door. He finds the handle and he forces it open. And what he sees inside of that little room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 years and 4 months earlier, when Timothy discovered that his wife Beryl was pregnant with their second child, Timothy really did go to his friend John for guidance. However, this is where the story takes a turn. When Tim came to John, who was medically trained from his time in the military, he would tell Tim, hey, I can perform an abortion on Beryl if you want me to. Timothy immediately thought this was a great idea. And so totally relieved, thinking his problems are now all solved, he left John's apartment and ran upstairs to his own. He told Beryl about how John could perform this procedure for them. Did she want to do it? And Beryl said, yeah, let's do it. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but the running theory is that sometime in November of 1949, Beryl and Geraldine left their apartment on the 3rd floor and went down to the 1st floor, John's apartment, and when they got there, it was just John. John's wife Ethel, she was gone for the day. As for Timothy, he also was not present for this procedure, but he likely knew it was happening. So Beryl and Geraldine, they walk inside of John's apartment, and pretty quickly, Beryl finds a place, or maybe John finds a place to put Geraldine in the apartment where she's safe. And then John ushers Beryl over to this chair. It's like his makeshift medical chair, and he tells her to have a seat. So she sits down, and John goes over and gets this device. And now this device, it looks like a glass jar filled with clear liquid, and then poking out of either side of it are these black, thin, hollow tubes that come out and connect at this kind of makeshift mouthpiece. And so John, he walks over with this device, and he hands the mouthpiece portion of this device to Beryl, and he says, here, put this on your mouth and start breathing it in. There's a gas I produce that kind of numbs the pain as I do this procedure to you. And so Beryl did as she was told. She took this mouthpiece and she put it over her mouth and her nose, and she began breathing deeply. And as she did that, John grabbed a chemical and he began slowly pouring it into the glass jar where these tubes were coming out of. And as he did that, a white gas began to form above the liquid inside of the jar, and there was a cover over the top of this jar. So the gas was trapped inside of this jar, and as Beryl is taking these big breaths through those tubes, she's sucking that gas into her lungs. And very quickly, as she's breathing on this apparatus, she didn't start feeling numb, she just passed out completely. However, this was John's plan all along. That device he made her put on her face, that was only designed to make people pass out. It was not to numb any pain. John was not medically trained. He was not performing abortions out of his apartment. He was a serial killer. So with Beryl now unconscious in front of him, John did the same thing he did to the other 2 women he had lured into his trap and whose bodies were now buried in his backyard. He began having his way with Beryl. And at some point during this assault, Beryl woke up and began trying to fight off John, but he overpowered her and he strangled her to death. And then after she was dead, John just walked into the other room where Geraldine was, and he used a shirt tie and he wrapped it around Geraldine's neck and he strangled her to death. And then after that, he put the mother and daughter together in some sheets and he put them out in the shed in the backyard. Later, when Timothy came to John's apartment to see how the procedure had gone on his wife, John would tell Timothy that, sorry, it didn't work out and your wife is dead. Don't worry, I'll look after your daughter and make sure she's taken care of. You need to flee London and go to Wales now. And so Timothy, without really asking any questions, would do as he was told and he would flee to Wales. But a little while later, when he tried to check in with John about how his daughter was doing, because he had no idea where she was or who she was with, John would just not let Timothy see her. And so Timothy, eventually just feeling racked with guilt about this whole situation, he went to police. And critically, when he spoke to police, he lied about what happened. He wanted to protect his friend John, who he looked at as a father figure, as a mentor, as a close friend. And so he said, I killed my wife. And so this is why Timothy got the location of his wife's body wrong, because he didn't know. He just guessed the sewer. And so that explains why when they got over to the sewer, not only was it empty, but it seemed totally impossible that anybody could have lifted this manhole cover on their own. It was too heavy. Then, after police discovered Beryl and Geraldine's body, and they went back to the London jail and told Timothy, that was the first time he found out what had happened to his daughter. Because to that point, Tim really did believe that John had just been taking care of Geraldine, or John had handed off his child to somebody else who was taking care of Geraldine. But either way, Geraldine was okay. So he's just been told she's not okay, she's dead as well. His whole family is gone. And so Tim was almost certainly in shock. And so he's sitting there with that sort of muted response as detectives are asking him, are you responsible for your wife and your child's death? And so Tim would say yes, but it's unclear if Tim actually understood their question or if he understood the implications of their question. He might have just been saying, I feel guilty about the fact that my family is dead, not that he literally killed both his wife and daughter. But when Tim finally kind of snapped out of it and really began trying to tell the truth that John was responsible, nobody believed him because his credibility was totally destroyed, because the first thing he did when he went to police was lie about what happened. And when police dug into Timothy's history a little bit, they saw he was a compulsive liar. Everybody said, oh, Timothy tells tall tales, that's just what he does. And making things even worse for Timothy was the fact that he had a very clear motive for why he might harm his family. He was under crippling debt, and his relationship with his wife was incredibly toxic and often became physical, and there were lots of witnesses to that. During Timothy's trial, despite the fact that Timothy and his lawyers tried everything they could to point the finger at John Christie, saying, no, he's the guy responsible, because John was constantly on the witness stand and had this impeccable resume as this war hero and this police constable, and he was well respected and he was well spoken and he was smart, the jury completely believed him. He was the epitome of credible, whereas Timothy was the opposite. And so it was largely John, the real killer's testimony that actually put Timothy, the innocent man, on death row. Also, the police totally botched the investigation from the beginning, because the police went into the investigation already completely convinced that Timothy was guilty. This was an open and shut case, and us gathering evidence and doing all this didn't really matter because Timothy was the guy. And so because the police were so focused on Timothy, they were blind to really obvious things all around them. For example, during their several searches of the apartment complex, both inside and out, a dog ran into the backyard and actually dug up one of the skeletons from one of those two women that John had killed years earlier and buried out there. And so a human skull and a human leg bone were visible outside as police are walking around. John was able to grab the skull and chuck it next door into a burned out building, but the leg bone was literally propped up against the side of the backyard in plain view. Nobody caught it. The police are also believed to have coerced Timothy into signing his final confession, where he says, I not only killed my wife, but I also killed my daughter. There's even some speculation that the police literally signed it for him, that they forged the entire document. And so Timothy gets hauled off and executed. Meanwhile, John, the real killer, just keeps on killing. He would murder at least 4 more women, including his wife, Ethel, using the same technique, the gas machine followed by strangulation. And it was during the time that he killed these last 4 victims that we know about that John became increasingly turned on by death itself. And so that was why he stuffed his wife's body right underneath the floorboards in his kitchen, and he stuffed those other 3 women inside of that tiny little room behind that secret door in the pantry, so that all day long as he was in his apartment, it constantly smelled of decomposing flesh. After Beresford Brown opened that secret door in the kitchen pantry and discovered those 3 women's bodies smashed inside of there, he would tell the police, and then 10 days later, on March 31st, 1953, John Christie would be found and arrested. He would confess to killing all 8 victims, but the police only had enough evidence to charge him with 1 murder, and that was the murder of his wife, Ethel. But he was found guilty of that, and it was enough to warrant a death sentence. On July 15th of that year, at about 9 a.m., John Christie found himself sitting in the same condemned suite at Pentonville Prison that Timothy Evans had been sitting in 3.5 years earlier. Then, moments later, the door behind John opened up. The same execution team that killed Timothy Evans came inside, they grabbed John, they hoisted him up, they moved him over to the door that led into the execution chamber. The door flung open and John got his first look at the gallows. They rushed him over to the middle of the room. They pulled the noose down, tied it tight around his neck. They put the bag down over his head. All the guards stepped to the side. And then right as the executioner is about to pull down the lever, John, out of the blue, says, "Wait, my nose itches." To which the executioner just said, "It won't bother you for long." And then he pulled the switch. Due in large part to the massive injustice in this case, where an obviously innocent man was carted off and executed, the UK would suspend the death penalty in 1965, and then in 1969, they would abolish it entirely. Between those 2 dates, in 1966, Timothy would receive a posthumous pardon for the murder of his family, meaning he is officially an innocent man.